Well, hi everyone. Ken Ham here, CEO of Answers in Genesis, Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, and I have with me Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson in this ongoing series on rewriting history. What does that mean? Rewriting history and the new history of the human race. A new history of the human race. What does that mean? And today's episode is called The Lost Relatives of Europe. I guess they're your relatives and my relatives because you all go back to Adam and Eve. So we have all these lost relatives out there, I guess. But first of all, Dr. Jeanson, rewriting history. What do you mean by rewriting history? This is part 7, by the way. And if people want to go through all the other parts, they can go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. And on the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, you see a playlist there, and we're putting them all there. So this is part 7, and then part 8 will be tomorrow night. But tell us what you mean by rewriting history, first of all, and what you mean by saying the new history of the human race.
What I mean is we live in an unprecedented era of historical investigation. For many years, we've had to rely on written documents, archaeology, and those are rather sparse. And there's many blank spots in human history that we've either had no documentation for, and I'm talking about post-Babel history, where scripture focuses heavily on the nation of Israel, but you don't really hear much about Papua New Guinea or China or these sorts of things. So the Bible doesn't mention them much, and mainstream history, archaeological history, written history also leaves many blanks. And the evidence we do have tends to focus on political entities, nations, rulers, culture, these sorts of things, which are all valid investigations. What it leaves out, though, is the history of peoples. So who do we come from, rather than what cultures do we come from, these sorts of things. So this very large question of the who of human history is accessible only through DNA. And because this is a very recent field of science, we didn't know DNA was the substance of heredity until 1953. And we haven't had human DNA sequences until the last decade or two. This is an aspect of human history that we've been unable to investigate until now. And what makes this and underscores the new aspect of this is not only the fact that we can use genetics, but also once you view the DNA evidence through the lens of the Bible and have these big picture framework pieces by which to interpret the data, finally the known pieces of human history pop out from genetics. That gives us confidence that we can start investigating the unknown parts of history, or in this case, taking the known history but looking at the people side of the equation and begin to uncover things we never thought and dreamed were true but are true. So that's the new side. It's genetic, and we're seeing it through the lens of biblical history. So the stuff we're discussing in these episodes, and especially in today's episode and following, you can find only here and nowhere else. You won't find this through commercial genetic testing companies. This is information that's new and novel. It's creation science in action. It's not just reacting to evolution. It's breaking new ground where people have not gone before, and people don't want to go, because the only way you can go there is if you adopt the biblical timescale, which is basically a swear word in our culture. You can't say 6,000 years without invoking some sort of reaction. But that is the key to understanding human history through the lens of the Bible and genetics.
Well, you said go where people haven't gone before. It almost sounds like Star Trek, science fiction, but this is not science fiction. This is real observational science. And to put it in context, help people even more, according to the Bible, Noah's flood was about 4,300 years ago. 8 people came off that ark. And then everyone today, if the biblical history is true, are descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their wives, going back to Noah and his wife, and then be going back to Adam. But everyone today in this modern world since the flood are descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, which means really we're more closely related than what we think, which is what you've been saying in the previous episodes and showing some fascinating insights. And so today you're going to deal with the lost relatives of Europe, but maybe give us a little recap too on what we've done before so people can catch up.
Yes, for sure. So let me see if I can get the screen sharing going here again. It'll help us with a review. There we go. Okay. Me and technology, not always good friends. So as I mentioned, the big question is who do we come from? Not so much where do we come from, though that's related to it. We want to know what are the relationships among people groups today. And I want to add another little side note here. For me, this is new history. Even as a creationist, we have rightly pointed to the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, the Table of Nations, Genesis 10, as the first impetus towards the formation of the very diverse ethno-linguistic groups that we see today. We're also very different in appearance, in language, in culture, and practices. Yet we all go back to these 8 people, and we've pointed to the Tower of Babel as the impetus for producing these differences. What has shocked me so much is to then take genetics outward from Babel and say what happened afterwards, and all sorts of even more surprises show up in ways that I never would have dreamed. I've taken for granted that the relationship between these ancient cultures and me being a Caucasian of European descent, these 3 cultures in particular have very little relationship to me. It's the, and I should mention that I'm half German. I'm not Greek, so I haven't typically adopted the ancient Greek people as my ancestors, the ancient pharaohs, because they're Egyptians, they're Africans, as my ancestors, the ancient Persians, they're Asians, as my ancestors. Typically, the people in these places adopt them as their own. I was just watching a series on King Tut, and they were talking to some of the Egyptian archaeologists and museum curators, and the modern Egyptians own the pharaohs as their heritage. It's natural. What I found out is these sorts of assumptions turn out to be wrong in ways we've just begun to scratch the surface in previous episodes. And just to whet people's appetite again for what we will be hitting, and we're going to be seeing some of these bullet points play out even today in this episode, we're going to discover that so-called black-white people exist. And what I mean is not that we are black and white, we're all just various shades of brown, but in the popular sense of black and white, Caucasian, dark skin, so forth. There are Caucasian people walking around who think they've had Caucasian ancestors for thousands of years, yet you go back just a few hundred, and you'll find they've had Africans in their family tree, and only Africans, for thousands of years. It's really shocking. We're also going to discover that most Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry, and we'll explore what that means shortly. We're also going to see that genetically European nationalities disappear within a few hundred years. So I'm proud of my German heritage, especially when Germany wins the World Cup in soccer and they do other things that are significant. Obviously not proud of it when we think about World War II and the Nazis, but it's natural for people to be proud of their heritage. I'm Spanish, I'm Italian, I'm Greek, so forth. Well, we're going to find out that this sort of national identity doesn't show up for reasons that we discussed in previous episodes, and for reasons we're going to find out today. Thinking about the indigenous people of the Americas, we're going to find out that the Americas were resettled at least once before Columbus. There's a lot of focus on what happened after Columbus came and how Europeans came over. There's some really big bombshells before Columbus that no one is talking about, and we'll find out because they're not using the young Earth timescale. We're also going to go back to the most ancient history. We're going to work basically from the present backwards in time until we get to the first peoples and some of the mysteries that show up there so frequently. Who were they? What are they doing? Evolutionists view them as part of this inevitable march of progress from primitive peoples to modern ones. We're going to find out a very different narrative about these folks and some ancient catastrophes that relate to them. And my goal overall in all of this is that we can all marvel at our own stories of who we are, how we got here, the stories of those we love, and to do so in a way you've never dreamed of, I've never dreamed of before. If you would ask me 3 years ago who I am, I'd give you a very different answer than what I'm telling today. So let's dive in. We're going to now start beginning to look at the human family tree. I'll recap what we've just discussed in a moment. I want to begin, though, by thinking about a historical event that many of us are probably familiar with. The phrase, "the sun never sets in the British Empire," used during the British colonial era to refer to the massive colonial expansion of the British Crown, where they had colonial territories in the Americas, in Africa, Asia, Australia. The point being, of course, that there's so much land under the domain of the British Crown that the sun is always shining on some of it, somewhere. I want to focus on the relationship between Great Britain and India. This was something that began, at least in modern history textbooks, with the East India Company in the 1600s. They arrived on the Indian shores for commercial purposes. This, over time, became political in nature, where in the 1800s, the British Crown eventually took over and ruled India, Pakistan, and those sorts of areas here highlighted in red. The British Raj ruled for nearly a century before Pakistan and India gained their independence. So the British were in India for several centuries. And to the modern observer, most of us viewing this would likely view this event in history, knowing what we've been taught in world history class, history of Western civilization, as a monumental meeting of two very different cultures, a clash of two ancient civilizations. And what I mean by that is, if you look at history textbooks, and they will often refer to the cradles of civilization, the places where we see human state formation and early concentrated organized activity at the earliest points in history, they'll refer to these cradles, about 4, 5, 6 of them, and India shows up as one of them. So the Nile River Valley is one of the cradles of civilization. The ancient Egyptian civilizations are some of the first that we see after Babel. You have the civilizations in Mesopotamia. I remember when I took world history, we covered Sumer and these sorts of places. Those were the initial ones. The Chinese dynasties began at a very early stage along the Yellow River. One of the last to form in a relative sense would have been the Olmecs in Mexico. But again, they're early ancient history. The last one I want to draw our attention to is the Indus River Valley civilization. India has a very ancient history and they're right to be proud of it. England isn't listed here as one of the cradles of civilization, but they also have very well-known ancient monuments to the activities of our ancestors, Stonehenge being one of them. So there's a long archaeological path back to the beginning for Great Britain. There's a long archaeological path to the beginning for India, and very little, if any, record in typical history textbooks of some sort of interaction between these two. Maybe some sort of commercial spice trade route, but nothing on the scale of the British coming and ruling like they did under the British Raj. Genetics, though, we'll soon discover, has something to say about this. And another way of saying this is, when these two civilizations met, few people would have predicted that this was actually a meeting of close relatives rather than a meeting of two ancient civilizations. In episode 1, we saw that the world is smaller than we think. If you look at the history of human population growth, go back a few hundred years, and there's 20 times fewer people alive back then than alive today. So we all come from somebody, but there's a lot fewer somebodies back then than they were alive today. So if you're someone looking for a spouse, your options are much more limited than today. And you're either going to marry someone who's probably a closer relative than we're comfortable with, or you're going to look outside your group, and this is going to begin to connect the people groups of the world. We also started with our own family trees, went backwards in time, said, okay, each of us comes from 2 parents who come from themselves 2 parents. So there's 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32. That multiplication, exponential growth happens backwards in time. But within a few hundred, 1,000 years, you find out that you have billions of ancestors in your family tree, something that can't possibly be true. And the only way to solve this math problem is to begin to connect these family trees to one another. That, of course, implies, if you apply that math around the globe, that there's been much more racial, so-called racial, more appropriately ethnic change that's happened after Babel than we're used to thinking about. And we looked at the genetics of how easy this is.
Dr. Jeanson, I just want to throw something else in here, just
Yeah.
for people to put in perspective. It's not something in your talk, and you might think that I'm way off base. But I think people also need to understand that as people spread out from Babel, or however you pronounce it, that climates were very different. You know, when we talk about climate change, there's been climate change ever since the flood. And there are places today that are deserts that you would think, how could civilization, you know, even consider, you know, being there as one of those particular places, one of those cradles that you talked about. But the climates were different in the past. They have changed since the flood. And so they would go out and settle areas that today we would think, why would they do that? And I just want to put that in perspective for you, for the people watching as well.
Yes, yes. And we'll get into that in great detail. There's some really wild connections and dots that begin to connect between effects of the Ice Age, its effects on climates, its constraints on where people could or could not go then versus today, which of course then affects who's related to whom, who you can marry, who's close to you, who's not. That is an extremely important topic, and we'll get to this in great depth once we move back in ancient history. Yes, thank you. That's a good point to keep in mind. We've touched on the cradles. That's just a little tease for what's going to come in the future. And we're going to see that the principles we discussed in those first 3 episodes, episode 4 as well, talking about slight differences in reproductive rates. One family might have 3 kids, one might have 2, and if you have that very subtle difference in number of children and you multiply it over just a few hundred years, you can have some consequences you never dream of. It's possible most Europeans are of recent African descent just based on reproductive rates. It's theoretically possible. Genetics can tell us whether or not this is true. We've also seen, based on genetic clocks, family tree is much shallower and shorter than we think. And as you've mentioned, Ken, this is going to have a big role then on how we synthesize archaeology, Ice Age, ancient human history together into coherent narrative, which we're going to do as we move back in time. We've seen that the global Y chromosome tree is the key to human history. That might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook. We covered in episode 6, Y chromosome is just shorthand for the male inherited DNA. And the reason we're focusing on this particular genetic compartment, which sounds somewhat confusing, has to do with the limitations of the standard genetic tests that you might pay for from Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, one of these commercial genetic testing companies, Ancestry DNA. If you pay them $100, standard price, what they're going to tell you is your heritage based on the DNA inherited from both parents. And if you're like me and have primarily Caucasians in your family tree and you want to know if there's an African or a Native American or one of these other people groups, or let's say you are of African descent, but you want to know if there's a Caucasian or Native American, you're of some, if you have a family tree of some that's dominated by some particular ethnicity, you want to know if there's another one. The problem is every generation in your family tree, that DNA from that suspected ancestor, that genetic signal gets diluted because you have DNA from both parents. So the African DNA then gets married with the, presumably in this case, Caucasian DNA. So now those offspring only 50% African. The next generation, their offspring, again, dilute by half, 25%, 12.5%, 6.25%. And we said below 10%, those readouts from these companies are likely not reliable or useful. And so these sorts of tests can only go back 4 or 5 generations, and then they lose their usefulness. And this is not because of some conspiracy or attempt to hide anything. It flows from the basic facts of biology. We all come from 2 parents who themselves come from 2 parents. And so you're trying to cram all sorts of ancestral signals into one person, and it naturally gets diluted. You can avoid that with DNA that's inherited from only one parent. We looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from mom. For technical reasons, this doesn't act as a very useful tool for interrogating human history. There's statistical limitations. The Y chromosome lacks those limitations. It comes only from dad. It's present only in males. It doesn't get diluted with DNA from females. And this, we said, is the key. It marks off 6,000, 4,500 years of time, is the key to interrogating who we came from. And what we want to do in this episode is look at some of the lost relatives of Europe, beginning to look at some raw family tree information from this Y chromosome. Now, we're not going to make it technical. Those last 2 episodes, 5 and 6, were probably as technical as we ever were going to get. From here on out, we're basically looking at family trees, which are straightforward, dates, and people. And that's really all you need to know. The first family tree I want to look at comes from a mainstream, publicly funded study called the 1000 Genomes Project. They sampled 26 populations from major regions of the globe. In gray here, you can see what I'm calling the indigenous American group. They tried to look at the DNA of people who were here before Europeans came. So they looked at the DNA from Mexicans in Los Angeles, DNA from Puerto Ricans, DNA from Colombians in the city of Medellin. They looked at the DNA from Peruvians in the city of Lima. They also looked at some African Americans in the Oklahoma area and people of African descent in Barbados. In terms of indigenous Africans, they looked at the Gambians from the Gambia, Mende people, a group from Sierra Leone in Africa. They looked at two Nigerian groups, the Yoruban ethnicity, the Isan ethnicity, and again, all these names are not things you have to remember. I'm just saying them so we know what we're talking about. There's the people from Kenya. There were 5 European groups. There were people of European descent, Spaniards in Spain, Italians in Tuscany, Finnish people, people from Great Britain. And they looked at it, this is actually a US population in Utah, but of known French descent. In South Asia, they looked at people in Lahore, Pakistan, Punjabis. They looked at Gujaratis from India. These people happen to be residing actually in Houston, Texas, but they're of Gujarati descent. They looked at Sri Lankan Tamils and Indian Telugus. These were both residing in the UK. The UK has a strong India component to it, but these are people of this descent, so they were using them as representative of these areas. And then they looked at Bengalis of Bangladesh. In terms of East Asian populations, they looked at the Japanese. They looked at 3 Chinese populations, Han Chinese in Beijing. They looked at Han Chinese in South China. They looked at the Dai minority group in China, and they looked at Vietnamese. If you're like me, you might look at this map and say, well, there's still big blank spots. How can this tell you much about the history of the globe? There's nothing in Russia, North Africa, South Africa. There's lots of stuff that's missing. Well, remember from episode 1 that we're used to looking at the globe in terms of political entities, but if you look at the globe in terms of people's population density, you notice that there are big gaps still to this day on the map where people are basically absent. Much of Australia, no one's there because of the desert. Same thing for the Sahara. Who wants to live there? There's desert down here. The Amazon rainforest, you have to clear the land if you want to have agriculture necessary to support population growth. The Rocky Mountains, ice cold in Canada, Siberia, the Tibetan Plateau, 1 billion people in China concentrated in the eastern half because this is largely uninhabited and hard to habitate. What I want our viewers to see, though, is that the 1,000 Genomes Project in sampling Indigenous Americans over here, Europeans, Africans through this band right here, Indians, and East Asians, they did a fairly good job of sampling where the people are. They may not have sampled all the political entities, but they're taking a where are the people approach, and then as a first pass initial study, what can this tell us about the global people's history of the globe? This is a good first step. So these are the populations we're going to look at initially. This is a family tree that results from some of the data. This is a tree I've drawn. It's zoomed out. We're going to go through in detail multiple branches on this tree. I've shown here an orientation to this tree that perhaps is not familiar. I'm used to thinking about family trees in a vertical orientation where me and my siblings are at the bottom. We have the parental generation above us, their parents, my grandparents above them. And so time kind of flows from top, the older times, to the present down at the bottom. This family tree is basically rotated 90 degrees, where the ancient times are to the left and the present times are to the right. So time moves from left to right instead of from top to bottom. I'm using 1990 as the year for the present, and this is because of the limitations of, or the details of this 1,000 Genomes Project. They rightly sampled only adults, people 18 or older, not children. And they completed their study, they said, by 2008. So subtract 18 years from 2008. 1990 is probably the most recent birth year for their participants. It may be 1950 if they sampled grandparents. So there's a roundabout date for what we're calling the present. And then I'm saying, for reasons we discussed in previous episodes, we can only go back to the flood. So we're putting Noah back here around 2500 BC. Now, there's a little bit of debate still. We don't have enough data to know where exactly on this, that you can see there's a blank line here, a blank line here. It might be hard to see because we're zoomed way out, and we'll discuss this more in future episodes. There's a little bit of uncertainty where Noah is. We know he's right here in this region. My best guess is that he's right there, but the dates I'm reporting are going to be from that position. Just know that there's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty for the dates we report. They're sort of round numbers. That's just a technical side note for people who want to nitpick. But generally, the dates I'm reporting are pretty good estimates. I want to draw our attention to a region of this tree that contains people related to the British Raj and India, and revisit the question with which we opened this episode. did two ancient civilizations meet when the British came to India, or were they recent relatives? Now, I've color-coded this tree so you can see the general region of the globe from which these people come from. Dark green for South Asia, sort of a gold for Europe, gray for the Americas, royal blue for East Asia, and then a crimson for Africa. We'll discuss what all this means again in each of these parts of the tree slowly in detail over time so we can all follow. I want to draw our attention to the top of the tree. Let's begin there. Zooming in, you can see it has primarily South Asians and Europeans. So the green for South Asians, gold for Europeans, and one person in the Americas, a Peruvian. My guess is this is actually a Peruvian who's of European descent. One of the sad consequences of the European incursion into the Americas is now about 80% of Latin Americans have obvious African or European ancestry, not indigenous American. And this is due to a massive population collapse we'll discuss when we get to the history of the Americas. Right now, I want to focus though on the South Asians and the Europeans. And let me zoom in here so we can see the individuals in this tree. So every branch here represents one person. And you can see the locations that they come from. The Bengalis from Bangladesh are represented, Sri Lankans in the UK, Gujaratis from Houston, the Telugus. Anyway, you see them repeated here multiple times because these are multiple individuals. The 1,000 Genomes Project sampled about, on average, around 40 to 50 men per population. There were 26 populations, 40 to 50 men. So there was there's sort of a narrow section of the globe, not a ton of ethno-linguistic groups, but just 26 of them, yet they sampled a whole bunch of men from each of these groups to take a narrow but deep dive into our past. And so if we keep going here, you can see more of the same, plus eventually down here is some of the Punjabis from Pakistan. All 5 of these South Asian populations are present in this part of the tree. And I've omitted the French descent people from this tree just to keep it simple, but you can see that the major European populations represented as well. The Tuscany from Italy, the Spaniards, the British, even the Finnish show up in this part of the tree. Now, that's who is present. This is a family tree, which means we can put dates on it using that clock that we discussed in the previous episode. Well, the date, the point at which all these branches come together, is AD 1500. Now let's walk through what this means step by step, beginning with the top parts there, the green branches. There are 4 countries represented. Pakistan, the Lahore, the Punjabis from Lahore, India, the Gujaratis and the Telugus. So 1, 2, the third country is Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan Tamils, and then Bangladesh is the 4th. What this tree means is that all 4 of these countries, 5 different ethnicities, all of them come together in the 1500s. Now, most of us have not studied Indian history. It's sort of a black box, doesn't mean much. I want us to see that this is illustrating the points we've discovered in previous episodes. Our family trees are more connected than we think. Next step, looking at the European history, something we're probably more familiar with and where it might ruffle a few feathers. I said on this branch of the tree, we've seen all 4 of these groups are present. All 4 of them come together in 1500. So this now illustrates one of those major takeaways that I mentioned at the beginning that I promised we'd eventually see. Here you can see on this family tree, Finnish ethnicity, Italian ethnicity, Spanish ethnicity, British ethnicity disappears AD 1500. Goes away. You can't talk about a long Italian Roman heritage. I don't have any problem with the Italians owning the Roman Empire as their heritage. We're seeing on this family tree, though, you can't distinguish an Italian from a Spaniard, from a British, from a Finnish at this point in the tree. There's other branches of the tree we're going to look at where these same populations show up, but in this branch, they all come together. You don't see a genetic basis for this sort of national identity just a few hundred years ago. That's one of the shocking results of the tree.
You know, Dr. Jeanson, I think even Christians who believe God's word and even believe the chronology taken from the Bible of the flood 4,500 years ago and so on, I think they tend to, I think most people tend to think of, oh, these cultures just go way back and they sort of forever existed. You know what I mean? I don't think people think of that recent, 1500 AD, to think that before that time, you're saying all those particular groups didn't really exist as ethnicities. I mean, that's sort of mind-boggling, just because of the mindset we have, I think.
And the collaborator I was working with on this project, we nearly gave it up once we saw some of these initial results, because it so strongly contradicts what we all take for granted and assume. That can't possibly be true. We must be going down the wrong path. We revisited, kept going, kept digging, like, nope, this is true. It's really shocking. It demolishes our preconceived notions, but there it is. But just as an illustration of that point, we were so shocked by it ourselves, we nearly gave up because we couldn't comprehend how this could possibly be true.
And I think another way to challenge people to look at this is, we tend to think, well, that couldn't be 1500. I mean, that's not long ago. Well, 1500 AD. But wait a minute. What was in North America 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 500 years? I mean, you start thinking like that, and you realize, wait a minute, think of what we look at as civilization today. I mean, Australia was first discovered in our modern world by Captain Cook, even though there were probably there were the Australian Aborigines there, and probably people before them, as I'm sure your research is going to show, just like it does here in North America. But you think about it, Captain Cook sailed up the East Coast in 1770, and 1788 the first fleet came, and then look at all the big cities in Australia and all the people. So really, 1500 AD, then you think, well, actually, yeah, I mean, we could see how all this could arise since that time. So I think people need to rethink history based on the Bible's chronology, and then you're looking at all this genetics that's rewriting history as we tend to think of it, but it's really confirming what the Bible teaches.
Exactly. And 1500, this is just 8 years after Columbus arrives in the New World. That resets how we think about time as well. I know as being born and raised in North America, that's how I think about the history here. It sort of starts in my mind, for better or for worse, with Columbus. We'll discuss about why that's not a good place to start in subsequent episodes. But I think of the European history and the New World starting there, and having been to Germany many times, it just seeing some of these old castles and the history that stretches way back beyond 1776 for the United States, and these sorts of things, like, oh, there's a lot more history here than I've previously appreciated. So this as well then demolishes things we've taken for granted. And if it's hard to believe, I want to re-emphasize, it's part of the reason we began with those first 6 episodes. This happens because of the principles that we discussed. These people come together because there aren't that many people around. They have to come together because there are limited number of options. There are fewer somebodies back then. Go back to 1400, there's 20 times fewer people on the planet than today. And we looked at the math of our family trees. You can't keep doubling your number of ancestors. My parents have to be more related to each other than I'm used to thinking about. All of these things are now playing out. Racial change plays out. Ethnic change plays out. Silent takeover of countries plays out in this family tree in ways that are shocking. And of course, the biggest shock is, I've emphasized the connections among peoples in South Asia. I've emphasized the connections among people in Europe. The biggest shock is this tree says there are connections between Europe and South Asia in AD 1500. That when the British came over in 1600, this was not a meeting of 2 ancient civilizations. In one sense, it was. There were civilizations in these geographic locations that have ancient histories. The peoples that are meeting shared a recent common ancestor. So think about in our minds how we view the peoples on these respective places. Most people would say, well, obviously you've got 2 different so-called races, ethnicities shown on this screen. We have two different languages being spoken. And in fact, there's a whole multitude of languages in South Asia. This family tree says these 2 people could very well be close relatives. Now, I mentioned there's going to be other parts of the tree that have Europeans, other parts of the tree that have South Asians. Let me tease with a shocking ramification here. What this implies is, I might be more related to a South Asian than I am to Ken Ham, or Ken might be more related to a South Asian than he is to me. There are Europeans whose closest relatives are thousands of miles away, and not just the next European country over. That's what this family tree is saying. The world is smaller than we think. We said the reason, of course, for this is the hockey stick shape human growth curve for human population. It shoots up around 1400, 1500. And again, looking backwards in time, far fewer somebodies back here than there. People groups have to come together. That same hockey stick shape exists for the European population growth. It goes down here because of the Black Death. Black Death wasn't really present in South Asia, so it doesn't have that dip. But again, the same hockey stick shape here. Family trees are more connected than we think. We've already seen that ethnic change can happen a lot faster than we think. Well, there's at least one major ethnic change that's happened here, either Caucasians going to South Asians, darker skinned South Asians, or vice versa. Again, we've seen it has to be true because our family tree is shorter. This whole tree gets compressed into 4,500 years. That's the way it plays out. It raises the question of, well, what possibly could explain this? Why? Why are these two groups connected? I can see, yeah, fine, the family tree says there's a close genealogical relationship, but why? Who moved between these two places? Who was the ancestral population? Well, let's just stop before we answer that question and say, these are the lost relatives of Europe. These are people we never would have dreamed are close relatives of Europe. And in our next episode, we'll try to answer the question of why they are the case and discover more shocking relationships and historical events that explain what we see, but have probably never been connected in the way we're connecting them prior to this time. This is the new history of the human race, and we're just beginning this deep dive into the human family tree to discover things that I never would have dreamed of discovering 5-10 years ago. Have been shocked myself, and I'm really excited for our viewers to keep following what we're going to find out.
And Dr. Jeanson, this particular research you're particularly following has been done on the Y chromosome, correct?
Yes.
And just to reiterate for people, what they're looking at are similarities and differences so that you can look at those relationships, correct?
Yeah, what we're doing is using the Y chromosome simply as a tool because we don't have historical records. I mean, my dad has done a deep dive into our family tree, but go back maybe to the great-great-grandparent level and information's gone. We can't go back any further. So the DNA is simply a tool to say, let's take it back a little bit further and reconstruct a family tree for all of us.
And to do that, you're looking at rates of change, rates of mutations, changes that you see, there are differences that you see there in the Y chromosome.
Yes, there's going to be differences between I have 3 boys, so my Y chromosome is going to be different by just a few letters from me to them, and you can see that and then create a family tree on that basis. I'm going to be different from my dad, and so there's going to be maybe 2 or 3 steps difference between me and my boys, 2 or 3 steps different between me and my dad, and so therefore about 4 to 6 steps difference between my boys and my dad. And so the number of differences, whether there's a lot or a few, helps us reconstruct, are there close relationships, distant relationships? It's all based on that sort of math. In a sense, the DNA differences act like a clock saying how many generations. You get a number, and that can tell you how many generations have passed between any 2 men.
And just to help people again, what causes those differences?
The best answer we have at this point is simply we live in a fallen world. There's imperfect copying in the cells that give rise to sperm. We don't live in the perfect creation anymore. It's been cursed because of man's sin. And so what would have been a process of perfectly preserving what God created is now imperfect. This leads to, even through Y chromosome mistakes, to some diseases over time. Fortunately, many of them do not give rise to disease. And these are the differences we can use then as a clock to chart the number of generations between any 2 men on the globe.
So even in a fallen world, God has made DNA so robust, it can have incredible mistakes, problems, changes, and still we're able to live on this planet. And, maybe this is off topic, but wouldn't that mean that human life can't go on forever? There's going to come a time when the mistakes are just too great.
Yes, and it's having been in the creation ministry for 10 years, I've had to change my own thinking about the medical side of the equation. When I was in graduate school working on medical questions, I heard genetics thrown out frequently as an explanation for this disease, that disease, and I kind of guffawed and thought that's just a synonym for we don't know what the explanation is, and I pushed those aside. Looking at these rates of change now, I'm beginning to suspect that we might be reaching a threshold. So for DNA that's inherited from both parents, typically if your parents are not that closely related, you might get a mistake version from dad, but mom still has a good version, so it's masked. Well, I'm beginning to wonder if we've reached a point where our ability to mask the accumulation of mistakes since the fall is declining, and that genetics might in fact be a dominant explanation for the diseases that we see today. And this is something where creationists might actually take the lead. It's not something I would have predicted, because I typically think of questions of the past as disconnected from questions of the present. Well, here's something where they begin to interface and meet, and how you view the history of human DNA differences will affect how you view their function, whether they're mistakes that do something good, or in evolution, they're beneficial and have accumulated over time to help us make us who we are, or they're degradation from a perfect creation that'll affect how you do medicine. So there are surprises to me even that are showing up, and they ultimately come from how we view the origin of these DNA differences, and they have ramifications for how we treat them.
Well, this is really powerful stuff, and you're doing number 8 tomorrow, part 8 tomorrow. So what's part 8? Just the topic here today was the lost relatives of Europe. What's tomorrow?
We want to begin to ask the question of why Europeans, like the British and people in South Asia, Indians and Pakistanis, have this close genetic relationship. The question I want to ask is, how many people, and not just Europeans, how many people are of Mongol descent? Mongols, of course, being the Central Asian people group that arose in the 1200s and created the world's biggest empire. How many people are of Mongol descent and don't know it? And this is not something you can find the answer to with your commercial genetic test. This is an answer you can find only here. So I hope our viewers will tune in for episode 8.
And this will all be put in book form for 2021. And you'll be releasing a book then. That's going to be a phenomenal book. I think it'll be very, very popular. And people can go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, and there's a playlist there that has all the previous 6 parts. We'll add part 7 now, and then part 8 tomorrow. So we look to see people come back tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Dr. Jeanson.